Salutations to the Truth Core, whoever and wherever you may be on the planet. I'm here with a commentary or follow-up to my talk on the Symbiont. And I'm going to describe a little more about this mysterious element, this mysterious clue in the Gnostic writings about the fragrance that was left in the atmosphere by the intercession of the Symbiont. This is an episode in the Sophianic narrative. And there are two different interpretations of that episode, so I will also take a moment to set out the difference between them. I'm going to respond as well to two specific comments. Unfortunately, I can't respond to one of them adequately because I can't find it. These strange things happen with comments on my channels. You know, there's a notification bell that shows that you have a number of comments. And typically when I click on that, there's a drop-down page, drop-down window, and I see a comment in there, and I decide to go and read it. But when I click on it, I find a list of comments, but the one that I clicked on isn't there. So I can't find this comment and quote it, unfortunately, nor can I find it on either of my channels, even though I explicitly remember responding to it on one or both of my channels. It was on one of them, I don't know which. Anyway, where to begin? Well, for me, there is an intimate beginning to this message, this instruction about the Symbiont. You see the picture there of myself and two kittens. The black one, Nikita, and the tiger, Rumi. I believe they were from the same litter. When I was living in Gaucin, in Andalusia, in 2009, there was a Danish woman in town who looked after strayed animals. So I knew her, and I went to her one day to ask her if there were any orphans around. And she took me to this garden of this house, and there were those two little cats. So I picked them up and took them home with me. That was in July of 2009. And they lived with me for some years, not long enough. And Nikita in particular, they were both undescribably precious to me. But Nikita in particular was a powerful ally of mine. And those who followed the Gaian navigation experiment for 3 years, between 2011 and 2014, will know that I often spoke of Nikki, who would be sitting on the desk, watching me, observing me, while I was recording briefings for the Gaian navigation experiment. And some friends who've come to see me, who came to see me at that time in the Serrania de Ronda, met Nikita and Rumi. I've had a few cats in my life. They've always been really special to me, enhanced my life, enriched it, brought beauty and wonder into my world. But I have to say that Nikita was something else again. I used to call her my 28 coil Naga cat. And Naga is a great serpent of wisdom. You find Nagas mentioned in Buddhism. In fact, it is said that at some of the discourses the Buddha gave, the Nagas attended. So you can imagine them sitting on the hillside or in a forest grove, big serpents 28 coil Naga serpents. And little Nikki, who was absolutely fearless, who was the most tender and gentle creature that you can imagine, had in her that power. And I saw it and felt it. And she communicated it to me, and she supported me in an extraordinary way over the years that we were together. Anyone who has what we euphemistically call pets, domestic animals, knows that their smell is a big part of their presence. So people like to smell their cats and their dogs and all sorts of other animals, their llamas and their horses. And very often, you hear the same response. The animal smells sweet. So all the cats I've known in my life smell sweet. But Nikita, Nikita, she smelled the sweetest of all. It was a smell of tenderness and beauty that I just can't compare to anything else. So what is it? What's going on with this experience of smelling animals? I'm smelling people too. Well, I smell people. I smell everyone that I get close to. And I could say, I love the smell of certain human animals that I've known and that I know. I love it deeply. And yet I wouldn't compare it to the smell of non-human animals. But why not? What is the difference? Well, for one thing, and you might have a laugh about this, but I think you'll agree that it's true, that in the course of an average day, I'm hanging out in the house with, say, a couple of non-human animals, like a cat and a dog, and I'm hanging out with another two-legged human animal. The amount of time I take smelling those non-human animals is a lot more than I take smelling the human animal. Isn't that true? And doesn't that happen? And that's odd. Why is that? Why would that be? It's not to say that the smell of a human animal that you love, a friend, isn't precious. It's just different in some ways. Somehow it's not as strong, or somehow it doesn't touch the same chord of emotion. It doesn't in a certain way reach the same depth as the smell of a non-human animal does. At least that's the case in my experience. I don't know about you. So what is it I'm proposing? Well, I'm proposing that the fragrance that was left in the biosphere of the Earth by the Symbiont, who came from the galactic core to assist Sophia, comes through more strongly in nature and in animals than it does in human animals. But actually, if you look closely at the narrative, well, you might see why that is so. The intervention of the Symbiont happened after Sophia had turned into the earth, but before human animals appeared upon the earth. There's a great lesson in that fact. There's a great lesson, a deep lesson, in that detail of the narrative. For one thing, it begs the question, if the Symbiont assisted Sophia in achieving interspecies harmony, interspecies symbiosis, without the human-animal present, what is the role of the human animal in interspecies contact? Intraspecies contact refers to the relationships and transactions and behaviors of one particular species with its members of its own species. So robins, turtles, whales, they have intraspecies behavior. But interspecies behavior is different. That's how the robin behaves with the field mouse. That's how the whale, the blue whale, behaves with the other fish in the sea, or with the plankton in the sea. And so here we are in the divine experiment with other non-human animals. And the question is, what happens in our interspecies relationship with creatures that are not of our species? And that's an open question. It wasn't established by the symbiont. We ourselves have to establish the interspecies bond. But the fragrance of the symbiont is here, like a reminder, something that draws us to that connection. The attraction to that connection is given, but creating that connection consciously is a human responsibility. I said that there are two versions of the intercession of the symbiont. So let me just briefly explain what they are. As a matter of fact, in the two previous editions, 2006 and 2013, you'll find a chapter called The Christic Intercession. And in that chapter, I drew upon Gnostic materials coming from the Valentinian school. And in their narrative, the aeon from the galactic core who comes to the earth when it is erupting with life in the early stages and performs that act of rescue or assistance, however you want to call it, was the Aeon Christos. Now, the Aeon Christos is not to be confused with Jesus Christ or Christ the Savior or anything like that. So I made that point very strongly in the first book, but I did designate the intervening aeon following the Valentinian narrative. So, the Christic intercession. But you'll find now in the forthcoming version that I've changed the title of that chapter to The Coming of the Symbiont. And I've changed the narrative to follow the Sethian version. And in the Sethian version, the Aeon Christos does not play the role of intercessor. The Greek name for the aeon that does play that role can be found in the original documents, and that name is ecclesia. Ecclesia. And ecclesia literally translates into the word church. So scholars of religion, grappling to understand the Gnostic materials which are far beyond their reach, simply say there was an aeon in the pleroma called church. Well, I guarantee you there was no church in the pleroma. And a literal translation of ecclesia would be the aggregator. Ecclesia has the root in it, Klete, like in the word paraclete. And what is a cleat? A cleat is a tool that joins two parts of a device. Two pieces of wood are joined by a metal cleat. So ecclesia is the aggregator who joined the different morphogenetic fields of the many species of creatures in Sophia's world and orchestrated a harmony among all of those different creatures. And you can see the evidence of that harmony in the world of nature everywhere you look. So be advised that the 2021 version changes, it doesn't change the story, it doesn't change the event or anything at all. It embellishes on the event with more detail, and it designates ecclesia, or the symbiont, as the agent of that activity, of that momentous pleroma intervention. Also, I'd like to point out, before I get to the comments, that the passages that you find in the ancient materials, you find them in some of the Nag Hammadi texts, but you also find paraphrases of the teachings in other writings, namely the polemics of the Christian fathers who wrote against the Gnostics. So the original story has been destroyed, but some parts of the story have been retained in what I call the dossier of the prosecution, those who attacked the Gnostics. The evidence says that the symbiont left an imprint in the atmosphere. It didn't only leave an odor or fragrance, it left an imprint. It so happens that the Greek word for odor can also be translated as tincture, a stain. So the symbiont left a fragrance and a stain. Now, I have dedicated a good part of Not in His Image in the second part of the book to describing what happens when you see the stain. So I speak about an image in the biosphere, which I call a luminous phantom. So there is a figure that does appear. I compare it to an after image. You know how that works. You look at something on the table, like a vase, in the bright sunlight, and then you look away and you have an after image. So the symbiont left an after image. And the evidence of history shows, both ancient and modern history, that there have been many instances when people saw that image spontaneously without knowing what they saw. So I, of course, have seen that image more than once, and I present my interpretation of what that image is, and in doing so, I present my critique of the misinterpretation of what that image is. So apart from that image, the luminous phantom imprint of the symbiont, let's consider the fragrance and this description that everyone uses without exactly knowing why. Everyone says the same thing. The cat smells so sweet. What I'm proposing is that that sensation of smelling an animal and registering that it is a sweetness is actually a supernatural event. You are actually touching something supernatural within the natural world. And it's true that the impression of sweetness through smelling can come with human animals, but primarily it doesn't. That's the point. Primarily it doesn't. It is there as a reminder of the interspecies connection. So when you smell another human animal, that is an intra-species connection. See the difference? You're smelling a creature that belongs to your own species. So there's a reason, and the narrative tells you this, it teaches you this. That's what the Sophianic narrative does. It teaches and instructs you in many things. And it teaches you that that fragrance you uniquely smell with animals is there to remind you that you are in the web of life with many, many other kinds of creatures. And it is your responsibility to establish your behavior toward those creatures, because it's not given, because humanity was not present when the symbiont was here. Clear enough? So let me get to the comments. Now, as I said, unfortunately, I can't respond to one of them as well as I'd like to because I can't find it. But that comment raised some striking questions, a couple of striking issues, and I reflected on them for a while. The comment used the term dehumanization, and it also referred to an example which I asked for and got about a vegan who was someone who was a champion of protection of animals, as most vegans are, but did not act in a kind or empathic way with human beings in a certain instance or in a certain context, something like that. So I have two responses to what I made out of that comment. I hope I'm not misrepresenting it. First is, there are people in the world who say, and probably themselves believe, that they have a strong empathy for animals. Particularly a vegan, obviously, would say that. But there's an element of make-believe, and there's also an element of virtue signaling that I have detected in those sorts of people. So a vegan might make a big case out of protecting animals and respecting them and preserving their lives. But making a big case out of it is not the same thing as an authentic orientation or an authentic position. In fact, I go by the rule that people who make an issue of something and promote it loudly, obviously virtue signaling, are suspect as to their actual intentions. So I would consider that as part of my response to the example that he gave. More importantly, use the word dehumanization, and he said, well, I know of cases of people who are very attached to animals, but they treat human beings badly. Well, in the first place, what do you mean by attachment to animals? Do you mean, say, the neighbor who is attached to his dog, his Doberman, or whatever? I know some people who have some Dobermans. They're very attached to them. And do you mean that the intensity of the attachment to that pet would be indicative of the symbiont, but then in turn, in their behavior towards human animals, they show bad behavior, bad attitude, or a dehumanizing attitude toward other human beings? What's going on? Well, in the first place, again, the evidence that you feel the symbiont cannot be found in the strength of your affection for your pets. It's much, much wider than that. And it can't be merely a token affection, like you sit in front of the computer and watch videos about the white lions of Timbavati and other animal refuges, and you feel a lot of emotion and support for the people who are taking care of those animals. No. That's not nearly enough. Feeling of the symbiont goes across the entire spectrum of animals, you see. And so I would say that no, the affection that someone has for their dog or cat or horse or whatever is not a sufficient or accurate evidence of the symbiont. Finally, before I move to the last comment, I would say that the word dehumanization is very, very tricky. Now, when I say your self-love is to your sense of humanity as your sense of humanity is to your empathy for non-human animals, then I am saying, yes, you measure the standard of your feeling for humanity against the empathy you feel for non-human animals. This proposition sounds disarming. It sounds maybe charming. I don't know. Does it sound baffling? Let me tell you, this proposition has to sink in, and it has to sink in deep before you can really get it. You may get it at first, and that's great, but the more that you contemplate it, the deeper it goes. And it does contain a ruthless message about humanity and what is called the sense of humanity. Remember, I said that the sense of humanity works two ways. It's your sense of the humanity in yourself as an individual person, and it's also the sense of humanity that you feel toward others externally. Well, this sense of humanity might not be what you think it is, and your feeling for humanity might not even be close to what you believe it is. The symbiont equation is there if you choose to accept it, like Mission Impossible, as a tool to establish a standard to measure your sense of humanity. You see, this is a complex, profound proposition. But to cut to the chase, I would warn you about a wrong conclusion. Someone who holds other animals in high regard, someone who does feel the power of the symbiont, who smells the fragrance, even though you may not have had the opportunity of a mystical encounter with the image, someone who feels that is not necessarily someone who goes around feeling love for humanity. It doesn't work that way. The formula doesn't work that way. If you do genuinely feel this deep empathy for non-human animals, well, it doesn't automatically imply that you have high regard for human animals. On the contrary, it could be said, and I've heard it said from people who are close around me, that, I'll put it in the first person, I don't care about any other human beings who don't deeply care about animals. You see, the standard cuts very deep into what you might think is your feeling for humanity. Love, affection, empathy. Notice I haven't used the word compassion. That is an entirely different subject. You keep compassion out of it. I'm just talking about empathy right now. Compassion is a different story. Maybe I'll get around to that one of these days. But anyway, how can I sum all this up before I move on to the comment? Well, dehumanization. What does that mean? Does it mean looking down on people? Does it mean racial discrimination or any kind of discrimination? Does it mean not viewing all people as equal? Not seeing all human animals that you meet in any social context or situation as worthy of your respect? Well, if it does, then there's a big factor of discrimination in the symbiont equation. In fact, it supports discrimination. In the first place, you discriminate against people who do not feel deep empathy for animals. I certainly do. And it goes even deeper, because your sense of humanity has to be selective. Discrimination, which is said to be a bad thing, is actually a natural imperative. Discrimination is absolutely essential to right relations between different races, different countries and nations. Absolutely essential. And the Symbiont formula introduces this factor of discrimination and shows you how to measure it and shows you how to apply discrimination correctly. I know that some of what I'm saying is perhaps not clear, or if it is clear, it may be troubling to you. It looks like I'm walking on quicksand, and I'm venturing into dangerous territory, and I'm telling you it is dangerous territory. Because if human animals don't learn the lessons of discrimination that can be seen all through nature in other species, then they've got a big, big problem. And we see that problem operating in the world today. I'll just give you one example, and then I'll get off this troublesome topic. But you know, when foreigners come into your country, when you didn't ask them to come, and you weren't asked by the authorities who brought them there, and they come and they show no respect for you or your ways of life, and they show no gratitude for you receiving them into your country, well, that's when you need to apply some discrimination. And no matter what the authorities will tell you, and the social justice warriors and the whole gang of usual suspects, the truth is, my friends, that you are not obligated to respect anybody. You are not obligated to like anybody. No, not at all. And you are not obligated to accept anybody in any situation whatsoever. That's discrimination. And it is your sovereign responsibility to learn how to discriminate. So anyone who tells you that you can show your love for humanity, your sense of humanity, by unconditionally accepting others into your life, is perpetrating a lie upon you. And it's your responsibility to confront and defy that lie if you want to see everything that is truly precious to you survive. So, on that happy note, I'll just turn quickly to the response that I can read, because I did find it. And what I find in this comment are 3 questions. 1, what is the origin of the equation? You're listening to it. 2, what does it mean if one finds their empathy for animals lacking or excessive? Well, once again, symbiont equation contains a test. It tests you. How could your empathy for animals be excessive? No, it should not be excessive. It should be just the right measure against which you measure your sense of humanity. If it's lacking, then your sense of humanity also will be lacking. Third question, is the symbiont the same entity as or an aspect of the Aeon Christos, or did other aeons come to Sophia's aid? Well, I explained that already. Two different narratives. 4, it is curious that one of the alleged long-term consequences of COVID infection is loss of smell. Any correlations there? Well, I would say that's a brilliant observation, and certainly there's a deep truth somewhere in that lie. I mean, it is a lie. I mean, what isn't a symptom of the monster microbe? But to the extent that it could be true, that could happen in some cases, yeah, I think it shows how nefarious and evil the story is, how evil the narrative is about the monster microbe. People believe they have it, and they're told that they're going to lose their sense of smell from having it. And so what happens? They lose their sense of smell. We behave as we believe, and the things we believe are encoded in narratives. Enough said, and I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.